there's any way possible. And so I learned how to do the other things, the installment agreements and things like that. But I found out that a lot of times when people came to me, they would come to me with all of their bankruptcy needs, and then they'd say, and this installment agreement with the IRS, I've been paying on it for 10 years, and it's bigger than it was when I first started. And that's because an installment agreement outside of bankruptcy, the interest and penalties keep accruing. But inside of bankruptcy, if it meets the special bankruptcy rules to be forgiven, then it just goes away. Or if you're in a Chapter 13, you can pay it off without interest. So you have a sum certain when you start, and you pay it off when you're done, and you get your fresh start. So that began my interest in IRS problems that just don't disappear. So let's see, then what I need to do is go like...
The little arrow to the right.
Okay, so there are many horror stories about the IRS enforcement of tax collection. They have liens, they have levies, they can seize your property, and they can virtually take all of your property to pay your tax debt. Now, with that kind of power, there's little doubt that this leads to abuse, especially when you look at the fact that reports show that as many as 25% of the IRS assessments are attributed to duplication and administrative error. Oops, 25%, that's like a quarter of them. The IRS data processing systems are so bad that the agency is routinely pursuing collection from citizens who already paid their taxes. But when you get a notice from the IRS, you usually freeze in fear because you know of their awesome power and you have to do something. There's also internal audits that show that there are violations of the federal laws, there's violations of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights Act. So really, my office adds a layer of protection so that the person no longer has to deal with the IRS. We take that problem off your plate, or not your plate, but anybody that you know, we take it off their plate and we deal with that. So when you hear somebody say, my IRS debt just keeps growing, tell them, go on the offensive. There are programs that will help you get rid of that debt. There's an offer and compromise program where it's like a settlement program where we go through a process of listing all your assets and all your income and your expenses, and the national average is you can settle your IRS tax debt for 10 to 20 cents on the dollar. There's also other programs, and that's what I was talking about in bankruptcy, where we can eliminate or reduce the tax debt. There's the Chapter 13, and this is one of the this is one of the things that Ed, for his gift that around the room, I got this, and it's so cool. Okay. Chapter 13 is the Wage Earners Repayment Plan, and Chapter 7 is the Fresh Start. So if you have an attorney that knows bankruptcy and knows how to discharge taxes in bankruptcy, they can take care of the situation. So what's the result of going on the offense? Freedom from the bondage of ever-growing tax debt, becoming productive once again, and the position of building a future for your family instead of being in debt to the IRS. What if you hear somebody say, my husband left me with a tax debt that I do not owe and cannot pay? What you need to understand about family law courts is they're a court of limited jurisdiction. And what that means is that when the court says, okay, you pay this and you pay that order, the creditors are not in there in court. They have not agreed to that order. So the credit card companies, the IRS, the Franchise Tax Board, they still have the right to go after either of the parties. What that court order does is it allows the other party to bring the party that didn't pay back into the family law court and have the family law court say, you should have paid that. So it is definitely a court of limited jurisdiction. But there is help. A lot of times when the marriages break up, the IRS chases the easiest target. And usually it's the woman, she still has the children, maybe she's trying to pay for the house. There is help for her. It's called the innocent spouse defense. And there's 3 different circumstances that will help her. The first is if the tax debt is due to an error in return. And it's attributable to the husband, and she did not know about it, she did not have any reason to know about the mistake, and she didn't benefit from the mistake, then she can be relieved of the tax debt. But you have to tell the IRS that. And the second is, within the past 2 years, if they've been divorced or separated for over 12 months, then she can change her return from married filing jointly to married filing separately, so that she's only taxed on her income, and then he gets the additional income on his tax return and has to deal with the IRS or the Franchise Tax Board. And it doesn't take his consent for her to change her tax return or amend it. And then they can see Ishmael about about something like that. And the third is when it's just unfair, totally unfair to hold the wife or the mother responsible for that debt because she's got the children and the husband just runs and it's and she's just left with the debt. But you need somebody to tell the IRS that and how they need to present the story. How about somebody says, I haven't filed tax returns in years. Usually what happens is somebody didn't have the money to pay their taxes, so instead of filing the tax return, they just figured that they wouldn't file the tax return and not pay the taxes, and eventually they'd be able to catch up. But each year, they can't pay their taxes, and now we've got years of unfiled tax returns. Well, there's a program for them. It's called the non-filer program, and it allows them to file their taxes, and the IRS will not prosecute the taxpayers for non-filing. That's actually an offense. If they come forward and they do it voluntarily before the IRS is actually chasing them around the country. There's actually 12 million people who have benefited from this program, and they're now free to live a normal life, not worried about going to the mailbox or shuddering at every knock on the door or trying not to answer the phone. Then you hear somebody say, the IRS filed a tax lien and now I can't do anything to pay it off. I had equity in my home, but now I can't get a loan. Or my credit report is now ruined from this IRS tax lien. Well, there's something that they can do too. If there's equity in your home, we can ask the IRS to subordinate the tax lien. And the IRS will do that if the new lender will actually give cash out on the new loan, and that cash goes to pay the IRS debt. And you can challenge the liens through a collection review process appeal. When the IRS files a lien, they have to notify whoever they file a lien against. So then, and they tell you what your rights are on the letter, but most people, they just go blind when they see something like that. So if they bring it to our law office, we can read it for them and tell them, okay, you received it on this date, you have this many days to respond, and here's what we can do for you. How about when somebody says, the IRS has a garnishment on my check, or a levy on my bank account, and now I can't even afford to pay my living expenses. They need a letter written explaining the serious financial hardship, and then they need all the backup documentation. That was a combination of words there. And explaining why they can't pay their living expenses or the levy or the garnishment. And then once the IRS agrees that it is a hardship, the IRS, if you ask them, will fax over the information to the employer or the bank, and that the garnishment is either stopped right then and there, and so they get their full paycheck, or the bank funds are released, so now they can pay their bills. How about somebody says, I can't even afford an installment agreement? Well, there's a program for them. You get a letter to the IRS explaining that there's no money after payment of necessary living expenses, and installment payment will create a serious hardship. And if you explain that to the IRS, and you get to yes with them, then what they do is they put the account in uncollectible status. Now this is only a temporary fix, but it allows a person time free from the pressure of the collection of the IRS or the franchise tax board, because they don't give up. And they can get back on their feet. Or it also puts you in a position to use an offer in compromise or timing for a bankruptcy. Because in a bankruptcy, the rules are, there's like a statute of limitations. So if the IRS doesn't collect it within this period of time, then they're barred from collecting it. So in an installment agreement or not an offer in compromise, because that holds the statute of limitations. But if you've got somebody in an installment agreement, a lot of times you do that so that you can get them ready for bankruptcy. If an offer in compromise, if they have no assets, they have no money, it's very easy to do an offer in compromise and settle for pennies on the dollar. I think that's the next slide. Yep, it is. So anyway, if you know anybody with making those kind of statements, have them come see. Are there any questions?
The procedure for the franchise tax board is the same as the IRS, and do they respond the same way?
State of California is a lot more aggressive. But they have basically the same kind of programs. Yeah. But different forms, different people that you're calling.
Will they respond the same way as the IRS, or they're tougher to deal with?
They're tougher to deal with, but they have, if you have a representative, they have a special department to deal with the representative. So it's a little bit easier than if you're just calling in on the 800 number. And the same thing for the IRS. And bankruptcy, they file proofs of claim, and then I know exactly who I'm contacting right away, so it's easy. Thomas?
Is there any option for people that have credit card issues but don't want to go through the 13 or 7?
They have credit card issues?
Well, they have obviously high levels of debt. It's causing issues. Should they look at a 13? I mean,
Well, okay. Credit card companies, it depends on how many you have. If you have one credit card, then you can negotiate. But if you start negotiating with a lot of different credit cards, it only takes one to pull a payment plan out and it won't work. And oftentimes people come to my office, they paid somebody to do a debt settlement collection thing, and they paid them a lot of money and nothing's happened, and they end up in bankruptcy anyway. So I usually don't advise those type of things. If there's one or two debts, or there's some reason they'll lose their license, people with a high security level in the Department of Defense, they cannot file bankruptcy. So in that kind of situation, I would help them out. There's actually Christian conciliatory, something like that, credit counseling. They're not the typical debt resolution company. They actually have more connections and they do it a little bit differently. So if they have like 1 million credit cards, and I would suggest they go to them, and if that doesn't work, then they can see me.
sounds good.
Anybody else?
Yes. In the bankruptcy code, when you, what is the look back period for those assets? You know, people move around their assets before they file bankruptcy. What's the code?
There's two different rules. If it's just a regular person, somebody that they don't have, okay, there's an insider. An insider is family or friends or business partners. That's 4 years, and if they think it's fraudulent, they can go back farther. If it's just a regular transfer, it's 1 year that they can go back. They have the right to, it's called a preference, where they can put it back in the bankruptcy estate, and then they sell it and they distribute the proceeds equally to the creditors.